everybody, to the 2021 Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Lecture in Social Justice. We are presenting the lecture in a format unlike any other we've done before, reflecting a year unlike any other. And in keeping with this theme, I am pleased to say we have today a speaker unlike any other, my dear friend and colleague, Professor Cornel West. For organizing this event, my thanks go out to Professor Margo Crawford and the talented team at the Center for Africana Studies. Theirs is a special talent, helping us to consider what we all can do to combat systemic racism and to build a more just and inclusive society. My gratitude also to the Office of the Provost and the Annenberg School for Communication for their support of this important lecture. The year 2020 was one of far too many deaths. Black and brown people died disproportionately. Our society suffered devastating setbacks in civic decency, attacks on voting rights and legal equality, and frontal assaults on the truth. If we breathed any sigh of relief when 2020 ended, it was short-lived. On a day dedicated to the peaceful transfer of power, the unholy ghosts of racism, anti-Semitism, and white supremacy reared their hideous heads. An attempted insurrection of our nation's capital was fomented by none other than the President of the United States, his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. Truncheons and tear gas for Black Lives Matter protesters, followed by selfies and salutes for insurrectionists. These dark times make us all the more grateful to have Dr. King's example as guide. We also lovingly recall our friend, the late Honorable John Lewis. He famously made good trouble. He urged us to work relentlessly towards a just society. Dr. King taught us that lies and deceit, even bombs and bullets, will not ultimately stand in the way of a higher truth. We celebrate having the first Vice President of the United States who is a woman of African American and Asian American descent. This historic first serves to underscore the chasm of injustice that still remains to be overcome. We stand as one in affirming Dr. King's legacy, to make our society more just, for truth to shine brighter. We must be determined to make it so. Thank you all for joining us today for a conversation about why race matters. We all extend the warmest welcome to Cornel West, whose intellectual gifts and generosity of spirit will help us to confront the most challenging issues of our day.
Greetings, friends, and welcome to our 2021 Martin Luther King Jr. Lecture on Social Justice, featuring the incomparable Cornel West. As a speaker, he is always in high demand, and we're very fortunate to have him with us in conversation with Margo Crawford, Director of the Center for Africana Studies and Professor of English. In this time of political, social, and economic upheaval, when the pandemic's racial disparities continue to shock, if not surprise, it's hard to imagine a thinker whose ideas have more salience and relevance than Mr. West. He has written that, quote, "The lens of race becomes indispensable in our attempt to understand, preserve, and expand America's democratic experiment." While painfully accurate and sadly still relevant today, his observation was made more than 15 years ago in the preface to his groundbreaking book, Democracy Matters. In that book, and his previous work, Race Matters, Mr. West argues that the very idea of America can only be understood with racism and classism and the resulting inequalities as definitional. As we've seen, our democratic experiment remains fragile. Yet Mr. West remains hopeful that from this difficult foundation, something glorious can still be created. The headwinds of 2020 have only served to reinforce Penn's commitment to our definitional values, the pursuit of knowledge to help build more equal, more just, and more global society. We recognize both our obligations and the challenges we face, and we remain undeterred. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, President Gutman and Provost Pritchard. My name is John Jackson. I'm Walter H. Annenberg, Dean of the Annenberg School for Communication and Richard Perry University Professor here at the University of Pennsylvania. It is an honor for the Annenberg School to co-sponsor the annual Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Lecture in Social Justice for the Center for Africana Studies. These events are always powerful, far-reaching, and critical discussions that help to set the tone for ongoing conversations we have on campus and beyond throughout the year. Given this year's speaker and his thoughtful take on the most important issues that impact our lives and our ideas about socio-political possibility, I have no doubt that this year's event will continue in that tradition of giving the Penn community much to ponder and revisit as we take on the challenges of a relatively new calendar year. So without further delay, let me briefly introduce our guest and our campus host for the 2021 Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Lecture in Social Justice. And I'll begin with my colleague and friend, Margo Natalie Crawford. Professor Crawford is the Edmund J. and Louise K. Kahn Professor for Faculty Excellence in the Department of English and the Director of the Center for Africana Studies here at the University of Pennsylvania. Crossing boundaries between African American literature, visual art, and cultural movements, her scholarship opens up new ways of understanding Black radical imaginations. Crawford is the author of Black Post-Blackness, the Black Arts Movement in 21st Century Aesthetics, as well as Dilution, Anxiety, and the Black Phallus. She is the editor of New Thoughts of the Black Arts Movement and also co-editor of Global Black Consciousness. Her latest book is being published this month. After Kenneth Warren's What Was African American Literature, her forthcoming book, What Is African American Literature, pivots on an important shift of tense from was to is to talk about African American literary production. Her essays appear in a wide range of books and journals, including American Literary History, Modern Drama, American Literature, The Psychic Hold of Slavery, The Trouble with Post-Blackness, The Modernist Party, Publishing Blackness, Textual Constructions of Race Since 1850, The Cambridge Companion to American Poetry Post-1945, Want to Start a Revolution, Radical Women in Black Freedom Struggles, Callaloo, Black Renaissance Noir, and Black Camera. Cornel West, Dr. Cornel West, is Professor of the Practice of Public Policy at Harvard University and Professor Emeritus at Princeton University. Dr. West graduated magna cum laude from Harvard in 3 years and obtained his MA and PhD in philosophy at Princeton University. He has written 20 books and edited 13. He is best known for his classics, Race Matters and Democracy Matters, for his memoir, Brother West, Living and Loving Out Loud. His most recent book, Black Prophetic Fire, offers an unflinching look at 19th and 20th century African American leaders and their visionary legacies. Dr. West is also co-host, along with Dr. Tricia Rose, of The Tightrope, which is a weekly podcast where they take time to welcome listeners and guests as thought collaborators with revered hosts and public intellectuals. Dr. West is a frequent guest on Bill Maher, CNN, C-SPAN, and Democracy Now! He has a passion to communicate to a vast variety of publics in order to keep alive the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., a legacy of telling the truth and bearing witness to love and justice. Without further ado, Professor West and Professor Crawford.
I would like to begin by thanking my dear sister, President Amy Gutman, who had many years at Princeton, and her leadership continues to flower and flourish. I want to salute Brother Wendell Pritchett, as well as Brother John Jackson, for allowing me to be here. And first and foremost, I am blessed to be here with my dear sister, distinguished Professor Margo Natalie Crawford, whose work has meant so much to me on the Black Arts Movement, its connection to contemporary artistic, visual, literary expressions, always subtle, sophisticated, keeping track of the rich humanity of Black people, but also critical of anyone who would impose closure, anybody who would talk about stop, and to be in conversation with her as it relates to the one and only Martin Luther King Jr. and the tradition that produced him is a joy. To say a last word about University of Pennsylvania, when I think of University of Pennsylvania, I think of giants like Houston Baker and Farrah Jasmine Griffin and Herman Beaver. I know Brother Michael Hanchard is here now. I knew him when he was a graduate student at Princeton. He's a towering figure in political science. But the formation of such scholars at University of Pennsylvania, the old Quaker site and institution, and having Black presence in this context does make a difference, and it says everything about the tradition of a Black people spilling over in a variety of different ways, even in 2021.
Thank you, Dr. Cornel West. I am truly honored to be in conversation with you today. And this event, this annual event, as you know, is named after Dr. King. I want to start by thinking about your book, The Radical King. And you write, quote, "Does America have the capacity to hear and heed the radical king? Or must America sanitize King in order to evade and avoid his challenge? Are we still evading this challenge of hearing and heeding Dr. King? Who is the radical king?"
Ooh, appreciate that question. And I'm telling you, there's a lot of different facets and aspects to it. But I think we have to begin with the notion that Martin Luther King Jr. is not an isolated voice, an icon in a museum. He's a wave in an ocean, that he is part and parcel of the tradition of a great people, a world historical people whose gifts to the world are an unbelievable caravan of love, in the language of Isley Brothers, in the face of 400 years of chronic hatred, of being wounded healers in the face of 400 years of vicious trauma, and being freedom fighters at our best in the face of 400 vicious years of terror. So that when we raise the question of who is king, who is the radical king, we're really saying, how do we keep track of the best cacophony of voices that come out of a tradition of a hated, traumatized, and terrorized people, such that the love of truth, and the condition of truth is always to allow suffering to speak, the love of beauty, and beauty itself is a creative response to terror and trauma, and the attempt to be wounded healers rather than wounded hurters, and therefore attempt to generate ways in which people can be enabled and empowered, even given the imperfections and the fallibility of those who are doing the healing. So for me, to think Martin King comes out of this tradition in the belly of a beast, in the belly of white supremacist slavery, for 244 years and almost 100 years under the U.S. Republic, of Jim Crow and Jane Crow, the belly of the beast, the spiritual decay and moral decrepitude of the American empire. That's the worst. Now, the best, of course, is the love of truth and goodness and beauty in America as a whole, no matter what color. You always got the John Browns, the Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschels, the Ann Bradens, the Grace Boggs, folk who are not Black in phenotype and characterized as Black in America, but who, out of integrity, honesty, decency, choose a love for truth and goodness and beauty to be in solidarity with Black people's struggle. So we look at America. What do we have? Well, what is spiritual decay? Spiritual decay is the relative eclipse of integrity, honesty, and decency, and it's replaced by an obsession with power, an obsession with wealth, an obsession with superiority. So a vicious legacy of white supremacy is not an abstraction. It's something on the ground that's very concrete, that exploits Black labor, that devalues Black bodies, that attacks Black beauty, Black intelligence, Black moral character. And Martin King is part of a countervailing tradition, countervailing figures that are rooted in families, rooted in communities, rooted in churches and mosques and temples and synagogues, rooted in sports connections, rooted in sonic confidence. I love that term from Rakim's latest autobiography, Sweating the Technique. Sonic confidence, so that the musicians oftentimes will be the vanguard, because they will engage and enact the love of truth and beauty and goodness. And some who are religious will even have a love of God, like myself as a revolutionary Christian. So that Martin King comes along then from Alberta, and Daddy King, no Martin without his mama and his daddy, rich tradition, Atlanta, Georgia. He comes along, product of Morehouse College, the great Benjamin Mays, Howard Thurman. He goes to Crozier, Professor Davis and others there at the seminary, PhD at Boston University, writes on Paul Tillich and Henry Nelson Wyman. All of these figures, voices, the love put in him, injected into his symbolic and literal veins, are then expressed in his own love for truth and beauty and goodness, and in his case of God. So he is a particular Christian preacher called in such a way that he's willing to bear witness to a truth and a justice. And yet that same America, even given the progress of the movement that he was a part of, and Fannie Lou Hamer always reminds us, Ella Baker especially, that the movement made Martin as much as Martin made the movement. See? But coming out of that movement, tremendous progress in terms of breaking the back of American apartheid. They did break the back of legalized Jim Crow, and that's a monumental move. But there's Jim Crow Jr. There's a new Jim Crow. There's de facto Jim Crow. White supremacy adjusts itself to new particular circumstances and conditions. And of course, the murder of Brother Martin made it very clear that there were strong forces of backlash, even given some of the victories, some of the successes of the Black freedom movement, which is a species of the love of truth and the love of justice. And now, when we look, my God, my dear sister, 50 some years later, you look at the spiritual decay. You got 58% of white brothers voted for a neo-fascist gangster. 53% of white sisters did. 35% of Latinos, and 1 out of 3 Asians. 31% of Jewish brothers and sisters. 28% of queers did. Only 14% before. 100% increase. Even our precious queers. 28% vote for a neo-fascist gangster. This is a sign, I think, of very deep moral decrepitude and spiritual decay in terms of people looking for a way out and moving in xenophobic directions, moving in directions in which they are indifferent seemingly to the suffering of the vulnerable, and especially of Black folk in hoods and brown folk in barrios, indigenous peoples on reservations, and poor white folk locked into poverty-ridden conditions. So I think Martin King would say, with Garvey, that Garvey used to say, as long as the masses of Black people are in America, they will live lives of relative ruin and disaster. We got 52% of our of all Black people have no wealth at all in the country. 52%. No wealth at all. No savings whatsoever. So effective wage stagnation, an effective neglect, effective abandonment. And yet, of course, the wealth accrued at the top has been overwhelming, unbelievable among the 1% and the 0.01%. That's what would bring tears to Brother Martin's eyes. He said there's 4 major challenges, lens to look at America: racism, militarism, poverty, and materialism. All 4 catastrophes. Militarism's an imperial catastrophe. Africana on the continent. 800 military units around the world. We got 4,800 in the whole world. United States, China and Russia together have 30. Military giant, dropping bombs in Afghanistan, Pakistan, drones in Somalia, drones in Yemen, and so forth. Then you've got the racism, which we know is a moral catastrophe. We've got the poverty, which is an economic catastrophe, and we've got materialism, which is a spiritual catastrophe, thinking that somehow we can possess our souls by means of possessing commodities, thinking that somehow things and possessions can actually be the source of deep meaning in one's life, thinking that titillation and stimulation have something to do with deep caring and nurturing, or at least replace deep caring and nurturing. All of those different dimensions. Martin always connected the existential to the economic, the personal to the political, as our feminists and womanists have taught us, and the spiritual to the social. One last point, Martin Luther King Jr. was an artist. And we don't talk about him as much, but he was an artist. And an artist is someone who looks at the world unflinchingly in all of its grimness and its bleakness, and still musters the courage to give us some form. It could be sonic, it could be paintings, it could be sculpture, it could be buildings, it could be a life, it could be a way of touching, it could be a way of loving that empowers and enables us. So as an orator, artistic. As a leader, trying to somehow deal with all the conflicts between Brother Stokely and Carmichael, who he loved so deeply, and Stokely loved him so deeply. John Lewis, Diane Nash, Bob Moses, we can go on and on, Gloria Richards, all of the groupings that he was wrestling with, trying to orchestrate some kind of mediation of the conflict. That's artistic. It's artistic. And people downplay the role of the artistic when it comes to politics. They downplay the role of the artistic when it comes to leadership. So Martin's got all of these going on. And at the same time, you know, we're talking about his legacy, because he was too much for America. His truth was too much. And I think in 2020, those who are seriously trying to be, if not disciples or followers, at least creative appropriators of Martin. I'd say the same thing about Malcolm. I'd say the same thing about Fannie Lou Hamer. Any of those persons who choose to work in their tradition and walk in their legacy, the words would be much too much for the dominant forces of America to come to terms with, I think.
You anticipated, Dr. West, you anticipated my next question, but because in terms of Malcolm X, was Malcolm X also too much for this world? When we think about the radical Malcolm X, you know, just as you're teaching us how to really remember the radical King, can you give us a glimpse of what we need to understand in terms of the radical Malcolm X?
Ooh, I appreciate that question, my dear sister. And that's one of the reasons why in the first paragraph of the text that you were kind enough to show and invoke, I talk about June 27th, 1964, when Malcolm X sends a note to Martin Luther King Jr. and says, "Will you go to me to the United Nations to put America on trial for the violation of the human rights of Black people?" And Martin says yes, through Clarence, Brother Clarence Jones, his lawyer. And of course, it was so very difficult for Martin and Malcolm to come together. I've got a number of criticisms of Martin Luther King Jr. One of my criticisms, I think he should have worked closer with Malcolm much earlier. I think he was too afraid of Malcolm X. And we've got to recognize our tradition is one in many. We've always had a variety of different voices, as long as it's a voice and not an echo. If you just echo somebody else's chamber, you don't need to be at the center of the movement, because you're going to get manipulated. You're going to sell out soon. But if you have your own voice, it means you have your own integrity. You have your own sense of who you are, so that you won't sell out. And many had deep disagreements with Malcolm, especially the early Malcolm, about white folk being devils and all that. We say, no, they're not devils. Do they have a lot of devilish behavior? Hell yes. but they're not devils. So, you see. So we disagree with that, Malcolm. But he was free, and he was speaking from his heart. And he said what he meant what he said. He wasn't posing and posturing like too many leaders today. And Martin and Malcolm should have worked together much more, but Martin was very, very fearful of Malcolm. Malcolm wasn't fearful of Martin, though. He'd hunted him down. He would have met him any second. That's the kind of brother Malcolm was. So they go hand in hand. You know, James Cone's great book on Martin and Malcolm go hand in hand. And there's a new book of our brother who just went to Texas. What's his name? He wrote the book on Stokely Carmichael too. You know who I'm talking about. God, I don't know why I can't remember his name now. But that's a good book too on Martin and Malcolm. But they do go hand in hand. It's not just those two, but it's also SNCC. You know, it's also Diane Nash. It's also Gloria Richardson. It's also Latima Clark. It's also Stokely and John Lewis and the others. But I think in Malcolm's case, you know, there's a sense in which Malcolm was freer than Martin. And by freer, what I meant was that is what the Greeks call parrhesia, Parrhesia, fearless speech, frank speech, unintimidated speech, a speech that comes so deep from your soul that you know you can get shot in a second and you don't care because the truth is more important than your life. Now, Martin had a whole lot of that. Malcolm had even more, you see. You see, so that Malcolm had a militancy, consistent, constant militancy that Martin was attenuating a bit. I think it was inside of Martin, but he was much more practical about how it expressed it. I mean, he was a socialist since he was 19 years old, but he didn't talk about being a socialist. When he first met Coretta, he said, "You never met a black socialist, have you, Coretta?" She said, "No, I have. Met him right here in Boston." So all those years, he's a member, you know, intercollegiate society. When he got the call to win a Nobel Prize, don't give it to me, give it to Norman Thomas. Norman Thomas, who's Norman Thomas? Well, I wrote an essay. I got it in the book, Radical King, the bravest man I ever met. Norman Thomas, head of the Socialist Party. Oh, Martin King, bravest man, Socialist Party. You don't want the Nobel Prize, give it to a white socialist. We didn't know you was a socialist. I've been a socialist all my life. We couldn't say it. We understand that. You know, we got to be improvisational now. We are jazz people. We are blues people now. But whereas Malcolm, you see, Malcolm would have said, "I'm a follower of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad." Well, he said this. That's right. That's what I believe. Well, that's gonna give you 2% approval in the country. I don't give a goddamn. I'm saying what I feel. Then when I change my mind, I'm breaking from the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Oh, that's gonna get you killed. Maybe. This is what I believe. You see, that's kind of brother Malcolm was. So it's a little different. And we need both of their spirits. They're just not identical. You know, it's not the same. It's like Jeremiah Wright. Jeremiah Wright is a son of Malcolm in the Christian context. And so he speaks honestly, candidly, and so forth and so on. He said, "God damn America," based on what William James said. William James said, "God damn America," based on its vile actions in the Philippines. That's what he wrote in 1899. That's exactly what Jeremiah Wright was invoking when he gave that speech, but it gets out of context. Fox News gets it. Brother Barack Obama's got to sanitize and sterilize and deodorize it in order to move into his presidency. You know, we understand you got to be practical and things. But Jeremiah said, "I'm speaking from my heart." And see, he come out of Malcolm X's legacy within the Christian church, whereas some of us are much closer to Martin. And myself, I try to have a dialectical interplay between the two. I really do. But I mean, the question of Malcolm and Martin is one in which they must always be viewed in an interdependent, related way. And not just those two, but a whole host, a cacophony of voices. You know what I mean? There's no such thing as a great Black voice being solely and isolated solo. Even Luther Vandross got to have Lisa and them in the background to make him sound as good as he, you know what I mean? No matter what. You know, what is Mary Lou Williams and all of her genius, Jerry Allen, all of her genius without the other voices? What's Duke and Count without the other voices? What's James Brown without the other? There's no such thing. It's always a cacophony. And we have to be very suspicious of the white mainstream appropriation of these Black folk and make them isolated individuals that they worship and fetishize and don't want to be criticized in terms of them having to meet the standards of the tradition that produced these folk.
Absolutely. So I want to say, so in so many ways, you know, what you're suggesting, what you're reminding us in terms of the problem of that fetishizing of the Black soloist, right? That it makes us rehear what Fred Moten says when he refers to the unalone soloist. You know, the notion of Black soloist, unalone, right?
That's a powerful formulation. Moten something else. Fred something else. That's a powerful formulation.
It's so much in the spirit of Dr. West of what you're emphasizing as well. So for me, when I think about the Radical King, your book, The Radical King, if I had to choose any sentence to hold on to one sentence out of all of the sentences that you deliver, it would be these following words. You write, for King, justice was what love looks like in public. Justice was what love looks like in public. Can you tell us more about that very idea, what you mean when you say that justice is what love looks like in public? Because we talk so much about King and love, but in terms of the Radical King, I think even in that very formulation, you're helping us understand other dimensions of the radical love.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's a wonderful question. Well, one is, you see, Brother Martin, like myself, decided to be a Christian as a young person. He got his religion young, the way Dorothy Love Coates sings about it. And it meant that he was willing to bank his life on a profound insight that comes out of the genius of Hebrew scripture that says to be human is to spread hesed, which is a loving kindness and a steadfast love to the orphan, the widow, the fatherless, the motherless, the persecuted, the subjugated, and the exploited. But the conception of hesed is deeper than the conception of justice. They go hand in hand, so that see, justice is what love looks like in public, just like tenderness is what love feels like in private. See, that's like Otis Redding, try a little tenderness. That's Babyface and Bobby Brown, that tenderoni. There's a tenderness, a sweetness, a kindness that is not reducible to just justice. Reinhold Niebuhr used to say any justice that's only justice soon degenerates into something less than justice, because justice itself can become an idol. You see this among a lot of the more fashionable activists sometimes, where they feel so good about themselves that they are pursuing justice. They're on the right side. I'm somebody. No, that's self-righteous. See, a genuine justice is motivated by hesed, motivated by love, because it's the care and concern for the folk catching hell. It's the care and concern for those who are being persecuted, subjugated. And because it's so overwhelming, you can never feel good about yourself because the suffering is too much. And it's always more than we can fundamentally attack at the moment. And it's been so much more, we don't have a language to describe it. So there's a humility, not a self-righteousness, that ought to go hand in hand with the struggle for justice. And so it is about love. The very notion of a self-righteous love is a contradiction. Love is about vulnerability. Love is about humility. Love is about learning how to die. You got to kill something inside of yourself, the narcissism inside of you, in order to open your heart and soul to somebody else, so that you are then empowered in all of your vulnerability with that other vulnerability, the other person's vulnerability. So that part of the genius of Black folk has been tied to the genius of Hebrew scripture and tied to the genius of Palestinian Jew named Jesus, is Canosis. You see, that the highest form of being human is to learn how to empty yourself, give yourself, donate yourself, give your all, whatever gifts you have, to provide a way of of using those gifts to enable others. And therefore, you get this notion of struggle. See, justice is not an abstract ideal. It is a force in the world. It is a verb. It's motion. It's movement. You got this wonderful formulation in your recent book called The Instability of Electricity. I love that. Effective energies unleashed. Like when Toni Morrison reads Corgadora, that stickiness, that pin in the gas that you talk about with Frederick Douglass. It's a powerful text you got. But you part of the same tradition. You a wave just like Mark. And I got my little wave myself. All of us are waves in this great tradition. So some become more visible. Martin's more visible than most of us, but he was human just like everybody else. And the question is, you don't have an ocean without the waves. You got to have a whole lot of different ways. And when love spills over in public, it becomes a force for justice. John Coltrane's Love Supreme becomes a force for justice, but it also, tied to tenderness and tied to beauty, becomes the force for beauty, becomes the force for the spirit, becomes a force for good. And in Coltrane's language, it's a force for God. Now, everybody don't believe in God. James Baldwin was agnostic. Shoot, but that brother, that genius from Harlem, he had so much God-like power inside of him that even when he left the church in order to be more Christian, in order to be more loving, one should say, that he recognized that there was something above his head in that last novel, just above my head. There's some power up there that I'm connected to, because everybody's got to get some distance from their narcissism and egoism. And usually it has to do with a power outside of ourselves, the love of another, an ideal that lures us or whatever, you see. And so in that sense, that's really what I meant. The moment when Martin was been in the paddy wagon, 4.5-hour ride from Atlanta to Reedfield. He's in there with a German Shepherd in the dark. Andy Young told me this. He and Daddy King were waiting for Martin. When he got out, Martin looked like he'd had a breakdown. He could not hardly walk. They had tears in their eyes. And all Martin could say was, "This is the cross we must bear for the suffering of our people in our struggle for freedom." That's kenosis. That's what it means to give everything. It's like Coltrane at Temple University in November 1966, playing so hard that he throws the horn on the floor, start beating his chest. Rashid Ali playing the drums, say, "Train, what you doing?" "I'm trying to express something. I'm trying to empower," and the horn's getting in the way. So he ain't fetishizing the saxophone. Love Supreme ain't about the sound and the saxophone. It's about what the sound is doing to other people's souls, other people's hearts, other people's sense of possibility in the world. It's like if we professors, we get so obsessed with our books, obsessed with our titles in our position. No, that ain't what it's about. They are to be used as instruments, as vehicles to try to make the world better, to kum alum, and to touch souls, and to allow our own souls to be wrestled with in such a way that we can be healed. So it's never just art for art's sake in the abstract, but it's never art reducible to politics either. It's art tied to life, and life is so rich and so mysterious and so unpredictable, like history, and yet all of them go hand in hand, the political and the personal, the existential, economic, and the social, and the spiritual in that way. That's what Martin King, like so many of the figures that we wrestle with in our classes and so on, is such a crucial portal. But we can't just get locked into him. He's got to open us into the richness of these Black peoples who produced him, and the other peoples too, but he's primarily from the chocolate side of town. He's primarily from the chocolate side of the American Empire, no doubt. And then also try to examine something inside of ourselves. You see, we don't want to escape from our own interiority in our own hearts and minds and souls in the battlefield that's taking place on our own souls, as well as the battlefield taking place in America, in the world. And at this point, with the planet about to go under, given all of this greed, manipulating, squeezing out nature and environment, that we got to avoid self-destruction as a species. And the only way you do that is the species itself has to undergo some kind of change and give up on some of that greed, give up on some of that small-mindedness and truncated vision as to how we make it in the next, hundreds of years. If there be a planet around, we just don't know.
Yes. So in the Cornel West Reader, you write, 3 related and fundamental questions motivate my writings. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be modern? What does it mean to be American? Why these 3 focal points: human, modern, American?
Dear sister, you going back to 1999, huh? Ooh, that's 22 years ago. I appreciate that. No, very much so. Well, you see, I begin with a reality that is still news to a lot of people, which is that Black people are full-fledged human beings who don't need to prove it to anybody. Something presupposed and assumed. And the alternative to that is Black people are in perpetual audition, obsessed with the white normative gaze, concerned with white recognition and approval. And if we don't get that, somehow we are failures. See, those are the 2 alternatives. So by assuming African man in the modern world, in the US version of the modern world, and Black people are shaping and molding modernity, shaping and molding the US version of that as human beings with all of our hybridity, all of our flexibility. And that means, of course, good and bad. We got Black thugs and we got Black gangsters, and we got Black saintly people, and we got Black folk who are trying to be decent. And I think there's always an intertwining. I know I got a lot of gangster and thug in me we won't get into at the moment, but it's always intertwined because that's what it is to be human. But when you start that way, it means that the Black people can never be ghettoized in terms of any discourse about humanity, in terms of any discourse about modernity, in terms of any discourse about the USA. And to not be ghettoized means in that you take a stand with your back strong, understanding those who have shaped you are allowing you to stand strong, and then you express yourself intellectually, morally, spiritually, organizationally, movement-wise, in terms of Black freedom struggles, or feminist struggles, or workers' struggles, or anti-homophobic or anti-transphobic struggles. But that has to do with always understanding that one's identity has to be rooted in a moral and spiritual integrity tied to an all-embracing solidarity for those who suffer. Because if identity floats from integrity and solidarity, then you end up with a class politics from above. And of course, the great Adolph Reed, who just retired from the grand institution, has taught us well that these narrow forms of identity politics become class politics, and you end up with a Black bourgeoisie that break dances to the bank or break dances to Martha's Vineyard. And you end up with Black poor and Black working people locked into the most vicious forms of decrepit education, indecent housing, hardly any access to healthcare, and unable to get jobs with a living wage. And so Black success becomes measured by how the Black professional class is doing. Black success becomes measured by the icons of Black celebrity rather than the rich humanity of the least of these, the rich humanity of Black poor and working people, oftentimes whose revolt generated the opportunities for folk to become middle class. I mean, I got to Harvard because the vicious assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. took place, and over 200 cities were burning. And Harvard decided, well, we only had 7 Negroes 2 years before. Now we're going to admit 90. Now, there wasn't no intellectual renaissance in the Black community that led toward that. And the legislation had already taken place in 64 and 65. Harvard didn't move. It was when the brothers and sisters on the ground, out of a deep love for their beloved Martin, who had been shot down like a dog in Memphis, their love spilled over, a righteous indignation all across the country. And then the white elite said, oh my God, we really got a Negro problem. And they opened Harvard up. And here come Brother West and many others of us. And I said, I'll never forget that. That's my source of opening the door for me. I'll be true to that in my own way. I ain't imitating anybody. I ain't emulating anybody. I'm a free Black man. I'm a Jesus-loving free Black man. But I'll never forget the conditions under which my success was made possible. It wasn't me. Folk on the ground, you see. And I think we've got a problem these days because Black freedom oftentimes is reduced to Black success for the few at the top rather than Black greatness for everybody. And greatness has to do with the quality of service to the least of these. That's my biblical criteria that I learned in Vacation Bible School. We learned that in Shiloh Baptist Church. If the kingdom of God is within you, then everywhere you go, you ought to leave a little heaven behind. And the heaven you leave behind means you're going to raise some hell in the name of folk who are coming to terms with nightmares conditions. It's like following Jesus into the temple where he ran out the money changers. He ran them out. That's why he was crucified. That's Martin's message. How many churches you know that got pictures of Jesus running out the money changers on the wall? None whatsoever. Yet they won't talk about the cross. That's the cause of the crucifixion. And who was in that money? What was that temple like? One of the huge edifice on this side of Rome. You had police on one side. It was a bank as well. So you talking about Wall Street, you talk about White House, Pentagon, Harvard, University of Pennsylvania, University of Chicago, Berkeley, Hollywood, critical of all of us in elite positions, not because we are elites per se, but because too many are choosing indifference to the lives of the vulnerable. Elites can be forces for good too, if they so choose.
No, and they must choose, because otherwise, Dr. West, absolutely, we must choose, because otherwise we become the elite who are speaking for the people on the ground, right? And the nerve of us, right? Actually positioning ourselves, right? To be that kind of mediator. Right?
No, I hear you. And that's the way Ella Baker comes back now. Lift every voice, which is the anthem of Black people means. You got to learn, listen, like a good blues woman or a jazz man. Learn and listen, find your voice, and be part of the cacophony of voices you so choose, always with a critical sensibility now. We're not talking about uncritical deference. We're not talking about groupthink. We're not talking about mob mentality. We're talking about people thinking for themselves, which means we're always going to have disagreement. What Ellison called antagonistic cooperation. That's what a jazz orchestra is, antagonistic cooperation. Voices bouncing off against different voices. That's a crucial thing. But integrity has to be at the center of it. See, once you get identity talk without moral and spiritual integrity, then it's just a cover for gangster activity.
Yes. So you earlier, as you were talking about the fact that we really need to trouble that impulse to fetishize the Black soloist, as you brought in so many other voices, one of those names was indeed Toni Morrison. And I know
how yes.
I want you to rehear some of the words you have shared in terms of Toni Morrison, and specifically, Dr. West, in terms
right there. There she is right there.
Yes, indeed.
There she is right there.
I'm thinking about what you have said about Baby Suggs' sermon in Beloved. And I hope for everyone listening, if you haven't read Beloved, read Beloved for so many reasons. And in particular, read Beloved so that you can encounter Baby Suggs' sermon. And Dr. West writes in reference to this sermon, you write, one of the great moments in American literature. And you also describe this sermon as one of the great moments in modern literature. Dr. West, can you tell us, I know that you are drawn to so many sermons. What is it about Baby Suggs' sermon? What is it about that moment in Beloved that you feel opens up so much?
I think it is the literary embodiment of a love supreme. Not just Coltrane's love supreme, but the love supreme that Coltrane himself was aspiring to, and the love supreme that Toni Morrison was aspiring to. In that sense, they become the grand love warriors of a great tradition of love warrioring. It reminds me of that line in Sly Stone, Sing a Simple Song, where he's got Larry Graham talking about, I'm living, loving, over loving. What does it mean to overcome by over loving? That produces an overjoy that Stevie Wonder sings about. And Stevie's part of that same love warrior class as an artist, you see. That what Toni Morrison was able to do was to show the ways in which we can use everything we got. And sometimes all we got is our bodies. All we got is what a scholar I know calls substance of style, named Professor Margo Natalie Crawford. And that substance of style has a content to it that has a political dimension, it's got a spiritual dimension, it's got a moral dimension, it's got an economic dimension. And Baby Suggs, all she had was her body and her brilliance, and most importantly, her heart, her love. And it overflowed. She was over loving, and the people could not help but respond to that deep giving. You remember, you get the same line in Ma Rainey and the great Sterling Brown. Herman Beaver's been talking about this in his poetry and his criticism for a long time. We said, what was about Ma Rainey? I don't know. She had something that just got you, grabbed you, connected with something deep inside of you. And this is true at the human level. You could be from Ethiopia, Guatemala, you could be from Tel Aviv, you could be from Gaza, you could be from Moscow. You're all human beings who get touched by something when someone is over loving you. And once that stickiness is unleashed, you start raising questions about yourself. Like, Lord, what was it? What kind of human being am I really that I can even feel that deeply? Because Baby Suggs is taking you to the lower frequencies, much deeper than Ellison himself. And Ralph was already down there with the lower frequency. Tony's even down there deeper. And what's deep down there? The funk. She ain't faking that funk. She ain't deodorizing that funk. Baby Suggs is providing a moment of funk, and funk is all about the love supreme, leaving the heaven behind. But it's Socratic, it's critical, it's prophetic, bearing witness to the vulnerable, self-critical. But it's also, and I love this work with my dear brother Kevin, we talk about the sovereignty of the quiet, and B. Brian Foster as well. There's a certain quietness to the role of silence, the role of surrender, which is different than resignation, different than submission. You surrender. It's like falling in love. That's not a submission. That's not a vicious form of obedience. Surrender is more subtle than that, you see. And Baby Suggs was emptying herself. Surrender, she's donating herself. You see. Reminds me at the end of a James Brown concert, that brother used to go for 4.5 hours nonstop. I must have seen him 25 times. And he would always end. He would say, I don't exist without you. I'm an extension of you. You're an extension to me. Baby Suggs saying the same thing. He would say, did anybody come here to hear a song that we didn't play? And the sister in the back would holler, he didn't play Soul Power. He said, hit it, Bootsy. And play the song right there, because he's there to serve the people. After 4.5 hours, he's still tired, can hardly walk. But we playing that song because somebody came to hear that song. James Cleveland would do the same thing in church. Aretha would do the same thing in church. Reverend Caesar Clark, Gardner Taylor, Carolyn Knight, all the great preachers. You come to give. And Baby Suggs takes all of that rich tradition and enacts it, and the genius and beyond genius of Toni Morrison puts it on the page. And it's prior to the 20th century. We think we on the cutting edge. We better go back to Baby Suggs. It learned something in the 19th century. Those Negroes had something going on. They didn't have hip hop, but oh, they had a whole lot popping inside of their souls under vicious conditions, U.S. conditions of Jim Crow, just off the back of barbaric slavery, you see. But that takes us again to this issue of moral and spiritual integrity and solidarity and giving in the most genuine sense of, and you see the connection between kenosis, this emptying, and the kinesis, which is the motion, keep people in motion, keep on pushing, a genius from the west side of Chicago named Curtis Mayfield said. That's Martin King. King is given everything to stay in motion, but it's also kinetic, you see, so that it's got to be, flexible and moving back and forth. Sometimes it's trickster-like, trying to dodge all the bullets and the white supremacist bombardment coming at you, and when to fight, so you don't fight. You don't fight in a moment. Well, you're not going to be as effective. You got to choose your battles, but know that when the battle does come, you're ready. You're fortified. You fortified in order to fructify. You got your courage in place in order to generate your deeds, your effects, your consequences. And there's a crucial distinction between foliage and fruit. You see, a lot of people produce a lot of foliage. Look at me, my success, my status. I'm the first so-and-so. I'm the second so-and-so. I'm the successful one. Good for you. What you gonna do with it? If you don't do nothing with it, you got foliage, but you ain't got no fruit. And somewhere I read, somewhere Martin read, by your fruit, you shall know them. By your deeds, by the risk you take, by the cost that you're willing to pay. That's going to be the great ones, you see. And that's why we come back to Martin and Malcolm and Fannie Lou and Nina Simone and Gil Scott Heron, and we can go on and on and on. Mary Berry, who I haven't said a word about, my dear sister Mary. University of Pennsylvania doesn't exist without her witness, her courage, her vision. You know what? By your fruit, you shall know them. That's what Martin reminds us as this grand exemplar of this great tradition of the world historical people named New World Africans, Negroes, Black people in the United States.
Speaking of that fruit, speaking about philosophy, sermons in motion, you have written in terms of why you think popular culture and Black popular culture matters. You have written, I focus on popular culture because I focus on those areas where Black humanity is most powerfully expressed. I love that notion, and I agree with you that Black popular culture really may be that zone where our humanity may be most powerfully expressed. Can you say more about why you feel that in terms of Black studies, in terms of philosophy, when we think about your positioning as a philosopher, why we need to care about Black popular culture?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I mean, two reasons. One is that, see, I do believe, following Ellison, that Black music, especially jazz, but not solely jazz, is a high, if not the highest expression of democratic symbolic action, finding one's voice, bouncing that voice against others so that the voices can shape the destiny of a group or a people. And democracy is fundamentally about those kinds of freedoms and voices in decision-making processes that shape how power operates in such a way that everyday people, ordinary people, can live lives of decency and dignity. And therefore, when you think of popular culture, you're really talking about the ways in which the sparks of genius and talent among everyday people can be unleashed such that they lift their voices and shape their destiny and others. But it requires cultivation. It requires education. It requires maturation. So that you have to grow up. You know, you can't just be childish. You always be childlike, but you can't just be childish. You can't be egoistic, narcissistic, tribalistic. You got to have something tied. You have to be tied to something bigger than yourself. And the best of popular culture in the United States is disproportionately Black culture. Probably the greatest aristocratic criteria of choosing the greatest artist takes place on Wednesday nights at the Apollo over the last 75 years. We choose her, Divine Sarah. We choose him, Michael Jackson. I mean, the aristocrats of the cultural sphere in the United States musically disproportionately come out of those Apollo-like moments where everyday Black people are choosing Billy Eckstine. He's the one who represents a level of excellence and so forth. And so popular culture is not about a dumbing down. It's not about a leveling down. It's about ordinary people being recognized in such a way that their genius and talent can play a role in shaping the destiny of a culture, of a people, of a society. But it's always through a critical filter. I mean, you know, again, you never want to just fetishize the popular. No, that can move in the fascist direction with no criteria to measure. But you don't want to demonize it either. Act as if there's no genius there. There's no talent there. No, that's that truncated elitism that is fearful of ordinary people's possibilities and potentialities, ordinary people's talents and geniuses, you see. But you know, in the end, it really is about whether, in fact, the American empire has the capacity to really respect the masses of its poor and working peoples in affirming their dignity. Because it could be the case that the worst of America remains the dominant form, and the worst of America is its claim to innocence. James Baldwin said the innocence itself is a crime before you commit an act. You can't be authorizers of forms of barbaric slavery and Jim Crow and Jane Crow and be innocent. America is unique among empires in the whole world to deny its empire and believe that it's innocent. F.O. Matheson, the great literary critic, used to say America seems to move from perceived innocence to corruption without a mediating stage of maturity. Peter Pan-like, don't want to grow up. Grown rich, grown powerful, grown wealthy, but hadn't grown up. Still too narcissistic, still too ostrich-like with head in the sand. Don't want to look at the barbaric conditions in the past and the present. Evade it, avoid it, or live in a state of denial, as the great Joseph Lara used to say, the 51st state of the United States. Folk living in a state of denial. They don't want to see how deep white supremacy cuts. They don't want to see how deep male supremacy cuts. They don't want to come to terms with the predatory capitalism of whatever stage it is. These days, it's Wall Street centered. Used to be more industrially centered. Don't want to come to terms with the empire and the bombs dropped and the drones killing civilians and so on, you see. Those are the kinds of questions that Brother Martin King was willing to raise, especially those last few years, though, my sister, breaking the silence. When he said a Vietnamese baby has the same value as a baby in Mississippi or Connecticut or California. you see. Same thing. We got to organize all poor people the way William Barber and Sister Thea Harris are doing today. And no matter what color the politician or no matter what color the elite happen to be, if they're not in solidarity with fighting against poverty, militarism, racism in all of its various forms, that includes anti-Jewish, that includes anti-Arab, that includes anti-Palestinian, that includes anti-whatever ideology that loses sight of the humanity of people. And if they're not coming to terms with materialism, King is going to be fighting against you, not by himself, because some of us are going to go down swinging in the name of King and Coltrane and Nina Simone and Curtis Mayfield and so many of the others who are part of that love train, on that love train.
Yeah. So Dr. West, when we think about King's very words, a riot is the language of the unheard. As you and I know, these words gained a renewed force during the protests of George Floyd's murder. And I was delighted to hear that. And I also thought, wait, people need to pause and really think about those words. A riot is the language of the unheard. What, Dr. West, remains in your estimation unheard right now? If you had to, as we end today, if you had to think about some of the issues, some of the ways that we need to think about freedom struggles in terms of perhaps what remains illegible, what remains unheard, what would you emphasize as we end today?
Well, I would say that that what is too often unheard is the massive suffering and hurting of those folk who are expressing themselves in the form of these rebellions. I applaud the marvelous militancy of the largest expression of protests in the history of the United States this summer. That when our dear brother George Floyd Jr. was publicly lynched, and to see the response all around the country and the world. And what we needed to do, and we continue to have to do, is that anytime you have arbitrary power deployed in order to murder or maim or violate the dignity and rights of others, voices ought to be raised. When you have something like that, a public lynching, especially on media, on the media, then it generates mass demonstration. But the real challenge is that you can't view it in an isolated way. There's a connection between police power, Pentagon power, Wall Street power. And when King was talking about the relation of militarism, the bombs dropped in Vietnam land in ghettos in the United States. At 53 cents for every dollar that goes to the military industrial complex. You only got so much money left for education, healthcare, housing, and jobs with a living wage and so forth. So that the militarism is tied as well to the inability to come to terms with the poverty. And then you got the white supremacy and the male supremacy and other forms of devaluing other peoples of color or sexual orientation, whatever, you see. So that what we need again is our identities grounded in these moral and spiritual integrities that take the form of all-embracing solidarities with those friends for no one called the wretched of the earth. There's got to be a connection between that local and the global. I know you got a wonderful chapter on the local and the global in one of your texts. It's hard to keep track of all your texts, you know that. You are prolific, I'm telling you. But the local and the global go hand in hand, as well as the regional. You see, but all forms of particularity, no matter how deep you dig in the roots, have to, in the end, be connected to a universality, so that the routes that you take in terms of how you see, how you feel, and how you act embraces people here and around the world. We can't be narrow and parochial. We can't be tribalistic. And I think what Martin would want us to say, and this is something that's so very crucial, what Martin used to say in the end, he said, you know, the sad thing is that people never understood me. Isn't that something? When he was shot, 72% of Americans disapproved of him. Over 50% of Black people disapproved of him. People forget about that. New York Times said he was just an echo of communist Hanoi because of his stand against the war with Rabbi Heschel and the others. You see, Black folk were saying, why are you talking about foreign policy? We just talking about civil rights. Why are you talking about the poor? We don't need to talk about white poor. We don't need to talk about brown poor. We talking about Black people. And Martin says, y'all never understood me. See, I was never just a civil rights activist. I was never just a patriot. I am a Christian preacher who's called to follow Hesed, pursue justice, and tell the truth that affects every corner of the globe, beginning with Black people in the United States. So I'm not gonna love everybody but Black people. That's sick. That's pathological. You love the folk you grew up with, and they give you the power through their love to love everybody. And he even loved his enemies, which I also pursue, but you need a whole lot of grace for that. Don't try that on your own. But the crucial thing is that he made the connections of local, regional, global, of poor working people here and around the world. And so that every flag was under the cross. And that cross signifies unarmed truth and unapologetic love. And that's the standard. You can even be secular. You can be agnostic and say, yeah, I'm into the truth and love now. Martin say, fine, but I got my cross. That's what that cross signifies. Because that's where the Canosis takes place. That's where the giving, the emptying, the sacrificing, the willingness to give your all to the cause that you are called to. That's Martin King. That's why he said at the end with tears in his eyes. Folk never really understood me. So I know every January, they're going to sanitize me. They're going to sterilize me. They're going to make me into just an American patriot. They're going to turn me into Santa Claus as if I was just somebody walking around with a smile with a whole lot of toys in the bag and can't wait to give out the toys and make everybody smile. And a lot of the white mainstream going to love me because, yes, I did try to love Black folk, but they don't understand. When I went to jail over 35 times, I went to jail for Black people. But that love for Black people didn't stop me from loving white people, from loving Jewish people, from loving Palestinian people, for loving Arab people, for loving Asians, indigenous peoples, and so forth. That's the love supreme that's always too much for the ears of the elites, too much for them to really listen to and understand the challenge, the fundamental challenge to the powers that be. And that's why we shall never, ever forget our brother Martin and all of the others who gave so much in their own imperfect, infallible, but magnificent, and I would say sublime ways. No Martin without Mahalia Jackson. Sublime singing her song of precious love. Thomas Dorsey, Pilgrim's Baptist Church in Chicago, when his baby and his wife die at the same time, and he shifts from writing for Ma Rainey to now Reverend Julius Caesar Austin, the pastor of Pilgrim's Baptist Church in Chicago, and writes that precious Lord, that song, the favorite of Martin Luther King Jr. That's the song that got him out of bed. Sometimes he couldn't even get out of bed, Andrew Young says. He'd have to call Mahalia to sing the song to get out. That's the kind of brother we talking about. Up, down, depressed, but never completely destroyed. He gets up and he takes a stand. He loves, he speaks, he sacrifices, he lives. Coretta standing by his side, strong as ever, brilliant as ever, progressive, much more progressive on homophobia than him. We got to push Martin on homophobia. Coretta's already there. Coretta beat him on the war question. She opposed the war before he did. Pushed him along with Stokely and Rabbi Heschel and the others. But this Martin, in all of his humanity, given all of his ups and all of his downs, and his sexism too. I mean, you can't be a Black man in America and not have some deep sexist elements you got to wrestle with and try to push out to the best of your ability. Same is true with homophobia. So he's not a perfect man, But oh, what a grand exemplar, even given his imperfections. That's what we've come to acknowledge, to applaud, and most important, to unleash in the hearts and souls of those who are here, to try to build on that.
Thank you, Dr. Cornel West, for taking us higher. Thank you, Dr. Cornel West, for this visionary jam session for social justice. As we end today, I want to read the words that appear on the award that Dr. Cornel West will receive from University of Pennsylvania Center for Africana.
You're giving me an award? Oh, Lord, I'm not worthy no awards. Good God Almighty.
And I want to share, as we end today, the words on that appear on this gift. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Lecture in Social Justice Award is presented to Dr. Cornel West for your tireless dedication and unyielding commitment to social justice. January 27, 2021, University of Pennsylvania, and then the final inscription, these words stated by Dr. Martin Luther King: the moral arc of the universe bends at the elbow of justice. Dr. Cornel West, thank you for your tremendous work.
I thank you and I salute you. I'm giving you a big hug, my dear sister. Thank you so much for all of your magnificent work. Absolutely. Absolutely.